So happy Monday, everybody. Hope this finds y'all doing all right and avoiding the COVID lockdown meltdown. Thank you so much, Garrity, for joining us today. A little bit of information and background on Katie. She joined National Association of Realtors in July of 2019. Before this, Katie practiced real estate and corporate law at both large and boutique law firms in Chicago. She uses her knowledge of commercial transactions to negotiate contracts on behalf of the National Association of Realtors, to support NAR's leasing matters and to assist with various investment opportunities. Katie also focuses on general corporate matters and risk management issues, which is why we brought her lovely self here today for us. She works closely with Realtor Benefits Program to make valued products available to all of our NAR members. She received a BS degree in psychology with a minor in business administration from Eastern Illinois University and a JD degree from Indiana University. And she has admitted to the state bar of Illinois. So Katie, thank you so much for joining us. And if there's anything else that you'd like to tell us about yourself, please feel free to do so.
Thank you, Melinda. I really appreciate it. I guess I should probably add to that now that one of my specialties is coronavirus, because for the past 6 weeks, that's been the majority of my work. But I'm very happy to be here and talking to you all about how NAR is advising brokers, members, agents on how to handle the issues that COVID-19 is presenting in real estate practice. As the virus has spread, so has our guidance. It just keeps evolving. For example, on March 4th, when there were only 80 reported cases of coronavirus in the United States, the main question that we were getting was, can agents ask clients about recent travel abroad? Fast forward 5 weeks, as of Friday, when we had over 427,000 reported cases in the United States, which number has increased, of course, over the weekend. We're fielding more questions and more difficult questions, such as, how can I still close a deal when there's a shelter-in-place order in effect? First, we want to reiterate that in the midst of all of these changes and confusion, the basics remain steadfast. The basics include, first, complying with applicable law, whether that be your state law, your county law, or your local law. And this includes any shelter-in-place order that you have in effect. We will talk about the Arizona shelter-in-place order here in a couple minutes. Secondly, be sure to communicate with other agents, clients, and other parties involved, including inspectors, appraisers, title companies, lenders, and recorders' offices. When you talk to them, make sure you explain what you know and also what you don't know, and try to anticipate and understand any delays that you may encounter in your closings. Third, review your contract. Keep in mind that the buyer and seller are always free to amend the contract as new circumstances arise. Something else that we're seeing is a lot of state associations have adopted addenda to attach to their purchase and sale agreements that deal with issues and delays in closing caused by COVID-19. We'll talk about that in more detail here in a few minutes as well. Finally, use best practices to meet your needs today. This includes remote work, which I think most of us are doing or required to do, but it also means holding virtual meetings like this, as well as enabling virtual tours of listed properties, incorporating 3D floor plans, using remote online notarization where it's allowed. We are now seeing many localities enact emergency legislation to allow for remote online notarization. So be sure to check with your area to see if that's available. And also use electronic recordings where allowed. Now that we've touched on the basics, let's touch on Arizona law. The governor of Arizona issued a stay home, stay healthy, stay connected executive order that's effective from March 31st through April 30th. This order directs all individuals to stay home unless they are participating in what is called an essential function. An essential function is defined in a previous executive order issued by your governor prohibiting the closure of essential services. And real estate services are included as an essential function. What's interesting about the Arizona law is it also prohibits any county or municipality from enacting a stricter law. So if your county or your city does not deem real estate an essential service, your order is superseded by the state law and your real estate practices can continue. We do want to caution that although real estate is essential in Arizona, brokerages or any business that continues are still required to promote social distancing and sanitation measures developed by the U.S. Department of Labor and the Arizona Department of Health Services. So make sure you're familiar with those. Also, simply because you're allowed to stay open and continue to operate doesn't necessarily mean that it's business as usual. Whether or not a brokerage, for example, stays open is a decision that should be made with the concern of the health and safety of staff, agents, and clients in mind. In continuing to operate your business and close your transactions, NAR has prepared multiple guidance documents for your review. This includes general guidance, transaction guidance, which covers listed properties, properties in escrow, and leased properties. We also have guidance on shelter-in-place orders. We update these documents very frequently and will continue to do so as the environment continues to change. You can find all of this for free at nar.realtor/coronavirus. So with all of this in mind, the guidance that we're preparing, I also wanted to talk about 6 of the hottest topics that we're currently receiving questions on and walk through those in more detail. The first issue centers around showing activity when a seller doesn't necessarily want to let prospective buyers into their home, as well as the permissibility of holding open houses. Another issue is attaching riders to purchase agreements that address specific coronavirus delays or effects that COVID-19 may have on the transaction. The third issue we're seeing a lot is the appropriateness of having clients complete health questionnaires. Another issue is whether hold harmless agreements are actually helpful for agents. We also see a lot of certain lease-specific questions. The 2 main ones include, first, a situation where a tenant does not want to allow prospective tenants in to tour the property. The second situation is where a lease expires while the tenant is in quarantine. And finally, we'll talk about how a brokerage should handle reports of cases of COVID-19. So first, let's talk about showing activity when your seller does not want prospective buyers to tour their property in person. Generally speaking, a seller has control over how their property is shown. And if they want to prohibit in-person showings, we recommend that you get those instructions in writing and consider attaching an addendum to your listing agreement to maybe extend the listing. Also, be sure to discuss alternative marketing options with your seller that will allow you to continue to serve them and market their home. On this end, consider 3-dimensional interactive property scans. There are 3 main platforms that allow you to do this. Those are Matterport, QPix, iSpy, and iSpy 360. I'm sure there are others, but those are the 3 that we've generally seen. Also consider implementing virtual tours or live tours, even using Skype or Facebook. And finally, there are options to do virtual staging that will allow you to showcase a property. Of course, if you do any of these virtual options, make sure that you have all necessary copyright permissions before you upload any of it to an MLS. Moving on to open houses, NAR strongly urges members to use virtual showings and to limit in-person activity in all other respects to the greatest extent possible, even when real estate is deemed an essential service, as it is in Arizona. Adherence to your applicable state law is only a minimum requirement. Realtors also have the special responsibility to take all necessary health and safety precautions and should lead by example when conducting their services in a responsible manner. To us, that includes leveraging virtual technology solutions and avoiding in-person contact to the greatest extent possible. in order to prevent the continued spread of COVID-19. To just expand a little bit more on the showings and open house issues, we're now also seeing responses from MLSs, a number of which have added fields in their platform to accommodate the use of virtual tours, virtual showings, and virtual open houses. Again, as I mentioned, when you do those, make sure you have the necessary copyright permissions. Some MLSs have even gone a step further and have disabled the use of in-person open house fields altogether. So make sure you know what your MLS response has been and are complying with that. The second question we're seeing a lot centers around riders to purchase agreements in light of the coronavirus. As I mentioned before, many state associations have created addenda that they're attaching to purchase agreements. These addenda address potential delays in closings as a result of COVID-19. These addenda may extend the closing date if necessary, but they also address matters such as the unavailability of inspectors or appraisers, a party's inability to travel to sign documents at closing, a party who may be subject to a mandatory quarantine, as well as the closing of or delay in government and business services such as lenders, title companies, or recording offices that are necessary to close the transaction. Some addenda will even address how the cost of any delay in closing will be allocated between the buyer and the seller. Be sure to check with the Arizona Association of Realtors to see if they've developed a form. If they haven't, feel free to reach out. I think we have some form examples from quite a few states that we've been granted permission to share. What we want to discourage here is agents actually writing their own addenda that may create more liability than it may actually help. Another question we've seen a lot is whether agents can have clients complete a health questionnaire before working with them. It is reasonable to screen individuals for COVID-19 prior to showing them a property. But over the weekend, NAR's guidance on this has actually changed from we were saying a questionnaire is perfectly fine to now we're saying it's better to ask these questions verbally than to get them in writing for fair housing concerns. It's still unknown whether COVID-19 will be deemed a disability under the Fair Housing Act. And our new guidance comes from some people believing that it will, in fact, be deemed a disability. So to avoid violating the Fair Housing Act, be sure to ask, again verbally, all individuals the same questions regarding their symptoms or exposure to COVID-19. If you have any clients who report being symptomatic or exposed to the virus, consider reasonable accommodations that you may be able to offer. Again, this could be as simple as virtual tours. But of course, keep in mind that the Fair Housing Act does not require agents to work with individuals who pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others. Also, when you're asking these questions to potential clients, keep in mind that self-reporting may provide limited assurance because some individuals are asymptomatic. So even when you ask a client about their exposure or their symptoms, make sure you take additional precautions, such as following CDC recommendations for social distancing, requiring guests to wash their hands or use alcohol-based hand sanitizer, removing their shoes or covering them with booties, and wearing face masks for all in-person meetings or showings. Another question we're getting is whether or not hold harmless agreements are helpful. I know this is an issue of concern in Arizona. Generally speaking, a hold harmless agreement protects a party from liability if another party is injured on their property or is injured during inherently dangerous activity. Liability requires proof of causation. Since COVID-19 is a global pandemic where the risks are widely known, since the disease is easily transmittable, and since an infected individual may not show symptoms for days after they've contracted the virus, it's our position that proving causation would be nearly impossible from a legal standpoint. Ultimately, however, whether agents want to employ a hold harmless agreement is a decision for brokers and legal counsel to determine. As I mentioned, we're also getting some lease-specific questions. First situation this arises in is when a tenant doesn't want to allow strangers into their rental unit or home to see the property. Generally speaking, a tenant cannot prevent showings, but in these unique circumstances, it's imperative that we consider everyone's health and safety first. Again, we want you to consider using virtual showings of the property in order to avoid in-person contact altogether. What's unique here is we're also beginning to see some states recognizing a tenant's desire to quarantine, and these states are actually prohibiting showings of residential rental properties. We've not seen this in Arizona yet, but be on the lookout for developments there. Where an in-person showing does take place, again, observe all CDC recommendations for the face masks, the washing hands, all of that. The second situation we're seeing in terms of leases is if a tenant is in quarantine when their lease expires. Several jurisdictions across the country, including Arizona, have temporarily suspended eviction and foreclosure proceedings under certain circumstances. For more information on those circumstances in Arizona, you can see your Executive Order 2020-14. Of course, the landlord and tenant are free to negotiate and extend the term of the lease. They're free to talk about rent. That's also a hot topic when tenants aren't able to pay rent. But we encourage open communication there and just trying to reach an agreement with all parties. So finally, we'll touch on how a broker should respond to confirmed cases of COVID-19. There are many situations that this could arise, including situations such as where a staff member or agent has a confirmed case. There's also a situation where a staff or an agent has had direct contact with an individual with a confirmed case of COVID-19 within the past 14 days, but that staff member or agent does not show it, does not show signs of symptoms, or does not have it. There's also a situation in which a staff member or agent returns from an area with confirmed cases and exhibits signs of the illness, but is not yet tested positive. There's also a situation where a staff member or agent resides in a household with someone who is under mandatory quarantine. Or the final two are where the agent's seller client has a confirmed case of COVID-19, or where an agent's buyer client has a confirmed case. NAR has prepared step-by-step guidance. It's very detailed on how to address each of these situations. You can find it. It's called the Sample Preparedness Plan for Circumstances Relating to COVID-19. Again, at nar.realtor/coronavirus. The key that we want to really bring home in each of these situations is that it's imperative to protect the identity of the individual who has a confirmed case of COVID-19 or who has come into contact or is in any other way connected to a confirmed case of COVID-19. So as I mentioned a couple of times, and again, you can find the answers to all of these questions and more questions at nar.realtor/coronavirus. If you have any other questions that you would like me to address, you can always feel free to email me. My email is kgarrity@nar.realtor, or we're opening it up to a question session now.
Let me take a look here just a second.
Sure.
It looks like we don't have any questions here. Does anybody have any questions for Katie?
Oh, wait. Answer the PowerPoint will be available later as well. This is Melinda. I was reading Dusty's question regarding the PowerPoint. I was thinking the same thing. Will this be available, sent out to us as well later, which I assume it likely will be?
Katie, with your permission, may I send this to our members if they would like it?
Of course, absolutely.
Perfect. Okay.
Thank you, Katie. Some
I
great,
do see somebody typing question
great points
here.
that you've highlighted on.
I'm glad. And if anything else has come up over the weekend that you think we should be aware of, let us know. We're happy to take on new issues as well.
Okay, we got some questions here. Melinda, would you like to read them?
Sure.
Okay.
All right, from Miss Victoria Olbaum, we have, can we limit showings to decision makers only, thereby not allowing children?
Yes, you can. And we encourage that. You know, a lot of states, I'm not sure if Arizona has done this, but of course, President Trump has recommended that we limit all in-person gatherings to 10 or fewer people. So it is reasonable that you restrict children from being present and just the decision makers, allow the decision makers to be there.
So Katie, if I can, you had mentioned that needs to be up to the seller. The seller dictates the showing activity. So as long as we have that in writing from our seller as far as what the seller may be limiting with children, that should protect us.
Yes, absolutely. Again, our recommendation is to definitely get it in writing, but what the seller wants is pretty much how it's going to go right now.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Did that, hopefully Victoria, that answered your question there. If not, let us know. Moving on, Heather Fisher, what do we do if we have rented out a rental property and the current tenants get COVID and cannot move out for the new tenants to move in?
So in that situation, I assume there's already a lease in place for the...
Yes, and we have a signed lease. Yes, ma'am,
Sure.
with new tenants, new lease
Sure.
agreement.
That presents a very difficult situation. Unfortunately, since Arizona is staying eviction proceedings, that tenant who has a confirmed case will likely stay in that unit for the full quarantine period or for the, and then if they're willing to move out after that, they can. Otherwise, they can stay until the end of the shelter in place or the end of this stay on evictions. If that is causing the landlord damages under the new lease, that is something that the lease with the current tenant will probably cover, and the current tenant will have to pay holdover rent to give the landlord some sort of remedy. I would recommend looking at that lease. As for the new tenants, I hope that they have a place that they can stay. Because unfortunately, they can't evict the current tenant right now. And also,
and on that point, we've had some questions. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, when the current tenant who has a confirmed case moves out, make sure that your landlord client, you know, does a deep clean of that apartment or house.
That was exactly where I was going, is are we seeing, I mean, I'm already having questions as far as how do we enforce the seller, the landlord, the current tenants in the property to clean out their property and verify that it's been cleaned, sanitized to the incoming tenant or buyer in that property. Do you have recommendations on how we handle that and write that verbiage in?
Sure. I mean, if you can amend the lease or get it in writing otherwise, I would say have them present an invoice of a deep clean. You know, have them hire professional cleaners and have them produce an invoice. I think that's the safest route. Otherwise, it would be just relying on their word that they did a deep clean, you know.
Right. Okay. And are you seeing issues with who's holding who accountable? For instance, if a tenant already has a cleaning deposit, but the cleaning deposit didn't necessarily account for maybe a more thorough, involved, more expensive cleaning process, are we seeing upset or issues over that, withholding who's going to take care of that, the incoming tenant or the landlord, seller, et cetera?
That's not an issue we've seen yet. But that's a good question. So I will definitely keep my eye out and see if I can get other input and if any other states have seen that.
Okay. And maybe going forward, recommending that we include some language that would go ahead and define that cost and whose responsibility it is moving forward.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Amelia Polito says, is there an addenda that is available that states this is for the new tenant's lease?
I'm sorry, that states what is for the new tenant's lease?
I'm assuming talking about the previous question regarding the lease with the COVID and if there's a holdover. Is that correct, Amelia? I know we talked a few topics before this question came up, but maybe explain. She says yes.
So attaching an addendum that essentially extends the start date of the lease? Is that the question?
I'm not sure I'm able to interpret that from the question that's here. So maybe, Amelia, while we go on with the other questions, maybe you can be a little more specific so we can get some clarity and answer that as detailed as possible. In the meantime, Heather writes, is there some verbiage we can put into our leases so that if the current tenant does not move out, the new tenants cannot sue the owner or brokerage because the tenant did not move out? So essentially, Heather, it sounds like you're kind of asking for a hold harmless clause in this regard.
Yes, I think you can put language or attach an addendum to new leases saying, exactly that, citing the stay of evictions in Arizona. Like I said, that's Executive Order 2020-14, and just saying, like, if your lease does not start on time as a result of this, the landlord will not be liable for any damages.
Or the owner and brokerage specifically.
Right,
in that
sure.
concern.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, sure, okay. Is there any other language that we should include in regards to home harmless to make sure that we are protecting our agents and our brokerages?
In that situation, I would check with your state counsel. They'll know the eviction procedure and whether any remedies are available for landlords in these situations, and the liability of landlords and brokers and agents in Arizona more specifically than I would.
Gotcha.
Generally speaking, for the other hold harmlesses that we talked about, again, NAR is kind of iffy on whether or not they're actually helpful because, again, proving causation is very difficult. Proving that the showing caused them to get a case of COVID-19 is very difficult.
Yes. Is there, with New York right now, seeing really the heaviest hit, is there any insight on what they're dealing with in regards to real estate that you're seeing that maybe you can enlighten and prepare us for?
Nothing that we're not seeing everywhere else. It's all kind of happening all together at the same time. Let me look specifically. I have a chart that tracks each state. So let me take a look at my notes for New York specifically and see if there's anything that stands out.
And I'm just thinking, just because I've seen it, the hardest hit location, in regards to just kind of preparing for the worst, maybe there's some lessons that we can take now to help prevent some of that and prepare.
Sure. So this is similar to everywhere. Real estate services are essential, but everything has to be conducted remotely unless it's legally necessary to be done in person. So, New York, the Association of Realtors in New York has encouraged their members to interpret that very narrowly and to do most everything virtually. The only other difference in New York is non-essential gatherings of any size are prohibited. Otherwise, New York is on par with most every other state in terms of what we're seeing.
Is it too early to see any lawsuits, real estate related with the COVID right now? I think that's probably to the point of what I'm looking for. There have been mistakes or issues that we're already seeing coming out that we should consider in the legalities of what we need to prepare for here.
We've not seen any lawsuits yet. That's one of the reasons, though, that why our guidance on the Fair Housing Act asking how the health questionnaires changed over the weekend, because initially NAR did not think that COVID-19 would be deemed a disability under the Fair Housing Act. But we were seeing some law firms come out and saying it could be. So we're trying to stay ahead of issues like that and say, okay, well, now this is how we're going to approach this. And so when you can ask, but ask verbally and ask everyone the same questions and think of accommodations. So we're trying to stay on top of topics that could result in lawsuits, but we have not seen any yet. I think in our litigious world, it's probably a matter of time, but hopefully we'll have all of our bases covered.
So for agents, thank you, I'm sorry to interrupt. So for agents and brokerages, if we have a seller that wants to enforce this using the questionnaire, and we give them the same, what you just explained to us, the concerns with that, yet they insist on proceeding with a questionnaire and simply screening the buyers before entering their home, do they have that right? And at what point does that right validate the rights of the agent, the brokerage, the buyer, to where it could create a lawsuit for us?
I mean, if the seller wants to ask those questions and, you know, still wants them in writing, that's a good question.
It's hard because the seller's in control. We need to follow and be loyal, right? Yeah.
Right. I would try to understand why they want it in writing as opposed to asking verbally. You know, if there's a specific reason as to why they want it in writing. If there is a valid reason, you know, as long as for that unit or that home, you approach every potential buyer the same way, which would require you to do in writing for every potential buyer, you'll be more likely to avoid fair housing concerns.
Right.
So I would say try to get it verbally or try to convince your buyer.
There have been,
or your seller, sorry.
no, that's okay. Because there have been sellers that have compromised, you know, the more susceptible lung issues, et cetera, where they feel like they're at higher risk. And they're saying that there are no exceptions to the showing, that if they want to show the property, they need to respond to this questionnaire. I'm asking, are we obligated to do that? Which it doesn't sound like it is, but, you know, as a listing agent, doing what our client asks us to do, and if they're control of the showings, what do we have to protect the brokerage and the agent for not complying to that, or do we have to comply to that?
You don't have to comply to that. You know, I think worst case scenario is, you know, you have an upset seller. I think, again, trying to understand why they want it in writing versus that assurance verbally, because again, either way, it's a self-report, right? And there are limitations to that, as some people don't know they have it, and some people who may know they have it, it takes a while to show up for the symptoms to show. So I try to understand why they want it in writing as opposed to verbally, getting it verbally. If there's legitimate reason, again, I think doing it in writing, but getting every person that comes in the house to get it, to put it in writing, will help you avoid fair housing concerns. That's my best advice.
Okay, thank you. I know that's a tough question, and I'm not really quite sure how to answer that. I think just leaving it up to the individual, and at the end of the day, leaving up to the buyer as well if they want to commit to that. I'm just concerned about what position that might put the brokerage. Moving on to some of the other questions. We have an anonymous attendee asking, can a landlord brokerage charge late fees for rent if the tenants are having an issue making rent due to work hours cut back?
So that's going to depend on state law. So I recommend you talk to your state counsel. The lease will generally provide that you can penalties, but these are very unique circumstances, and every state is approaching it a little bit differently. So I would check with
correct, right. In my understanding too, it could depend on if that landlord has a mortgage or not on the property too, regarding forbearance.
Sure.
Is that right, Katie?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So it's individual, it looks like, with a little bit more information needed. Norma Dotson asked, we as agents, do we carry any liability if we show a house and later someone in the family of the seller gets sick and the seller claims that we brought a COVID-19 sick buyer to their home? I think proving that might be difficult, but.
Exactly. Again, proving causation would be extremely difficult. Also, it's up to the seller if they want to keep showing the property. So if they do, that's a risk inherent in showing the property. And that's something that you should have conversations with your sellers on. And if they want to still have in-person showings, they need to understand that that's a risk. But liability would be very difficult to prove because, again, it would be very hard to prove that it was you bringing someone in that house that gave them COVID-19.
On that note, and I apologize, you might have mentioned this already and I missed it, but is there something the NAR, or is it even recommended, that at this time, just to protect agents and brokerages, ensure that there's an understanding on what the showings will include, that there's a document created to get sellers permission on what instructions they want us to adhere to at this point? Is that something that a brokerage should create, that NAR is recommending, or an individual to create?
Sure. So if the seller wants any changes to the listing agreement in terms of how they're going to show the property from here on out, we do recommend getting that in writing. We have not developed a form. We've not seen forms. I would assume it's a form that brokerages create for each situation.
Mm-hmm.
Because each situation will likely be different.
Are you recommending then?
Sorry?
Yeah, but you do recommend that maybe but do you recommend that a brokerage create their own documents versus just having in writing so it's not vague, and to ensure that maybe all of our files are consistent and therefore providing more protection of liability, is that we create something within our brokerage that defines what seller's given permission for their showings to be?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. If that's something that brokerage is capable and willing to do, I think that's a great idea.
Okay. Would you know where we just kind of create based on our own standards, or do you think there's anywhere we would find language from NAR to support how we would phrase that or write that?
I can ask and see if we've seen any other addenda to listing agreements and try to get some
Okay.
examples. So I'll reach out and see if I can find anything for you.
Okay, that would be great. And then maybe too, I guess, in the meantime, we could also go to our legal counsel for our brokerages too, for their input.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. All right. Victoria, next question was, any Airbnb issues coming up regarding owners canceling reservations or mandating questionnaires?
So a lot of states are now prohibiting Airbnb rentals and canceling existing reservations not made prior to some X date that state prescribes. So again, we've not seen any issues with this yet, but I would check with your state, your county, your municipality, and see how they are handling the issue, because starting last week, I saw a lot of these short-term Airbnb rentals now being prohibited.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Helen Clark question, do you have any recommendations on how to handle the home inspections with tenants not wanting to allow access or with any other transaction?
So yes, again, that's going to depend on where you're at, because like I mentioned, we're starting to see certain states respect the wishes of tenants and not allowing anyone into their home. But of course, you can't really close a transaction without getting an inspection. So this is a new issue that we don't really have any guidance on yet. I think first and foremost, we need to figure out why the tenant does not want an inspector in there. If it is a confirmed case, obviously that presents a completely different issue where the inspector probably should not be allowed in the house. But this is also where attaching an addendum to the purchase and sale agreement, which I said, earlier, addresses issues such as delays in inspections, would come in handy. That would probably push back the closing, but that seems to be the safest route, and also the route that will protect the agent as well. So again, I'm not sure if Arizona has a form addendum, but check with them, and then if not, let me know and I can pull some from other states.
We have a COVID-19 addendum that does specify that if we do have the parties understand that there's delays based on COVID-19 quarantine or infection, that the parties will mutually agree to extend a certain date or by 30 days. So we do have an Arizona created form that kind of gives a blanket of things. My concern as a broker is the agents taking some of that language, picking it apart and using it on their own, I suppose, based on the given situation. So any template that we have in regards to all these many different situations and concerns that we've got that specify legal language to protect everybody, I think is definitely needed right now to protect everybody.
Sure. How, so my curiosity, how are tenants taking this language and kind of tearing it apart?
No, the agents.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, not the tenants. The agents, when they are drafting, when they're to write language in the contracts, tweaking some of what's in our Arizona doc form, as well as using, in different situations. That's always a risk factor, right, regardless of the situation. But now, given the situation, the complexity of the issues and effects it can cause, I think that's my biggest concern is the language not being correct.
Yeah, and that's a valid concern, because like I mentioned earlier, we want these forms to be consistent across state or brokerage or wherever the case may be, because typically, those have had legal eyes on them as well as business eyes, and they're more likely to protect everyone from liability when we get individuals in there changing them in certain ways. It can actually affect that protection. So I completely understand your concern.
Right.
And you're not going to be able to stop everyone, but just encourage agents as much as possible to not change the forms.
Right. Great. And so those are all the questions that I have right now, unless anybody else would like to please go ahead and provide your questions here. One of the things, and I don't know if you have access to this, is I'm kind of a stats and data junkie, but is there any information you can provide as far as showing activity? How is the nation right now in regards to showings and pending sales and overall general perception? I guess how strong is the market nationwide with what's going on? I know it's impacted differently. Overview or stats or data you can give right now that we can take back just to kind of educate how this is impacting us nationally.
So we did a survey, but I know it's very outdated. But we are seeing, obviously, a very large decrease in the number of showings. Last I heard, activity wasn't down because, our agents are employing all these virtual options and buyers are taking advantage of them. We expect to see that activity go down and actual closings go down, but as of our last survey, and I'm just trying to find it to see if I could get a date, but I'm having a hard time finding that date. But I will try to find more information and provide that to you as well.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Of course.
But you're, as far as just an overview, are you seeing anything really traumatic right now? Concerns? I mean, we've got enough concerns with the economy. I think I'm just trying to get a sense of how traumatic is this going to be on the housing market. And I know we're still fairly early on, really, to determine that. Do we know, a projection that it's going to take 60 to 90 days, maybe 120 days? Is it still too hard to even look that far to figure out how long this is going to impact the housing market?
We don't know. No. And unfortunately, there are just too many unknowns with coronavirus. I think when this first started at the beginning of March, we didn't think it would be this bad in the United States. At least I didn't, for sure. So it's very hard to say how much longer or the impact that it will ultimately have. Our advocacy team is pushing very hard to get real estate to be deemed an essential service in every state, and provide more benefits to agents and realtors, and to try to lessen the impact. But unfortunately, we don't know what that is going to be. But I did, on the other hand, find this study. So we did a study on April 5th. And it looks like 90% of members said that buyer interest has declined. 80% of members cited a decline in the number of homes on the market.
Does that happen to be the one that Lauren June did? I saw one, I think, that was earlier on in March that looked at that, maybe a 2-week difference. Is this a new report maybe that Lauren June did that you're referencing we could have access to?
So it's on NAR.Realtor. It's NAR's flash survey economic pulse. Here, I can send you the link. Let's see if I can chat it to you. Let me know if you just got it. I just sent it.
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
That'll satisfy my nerdism.
I completely understand.
Great. And then I do have a question here. I've got another question from an anonymous attendee that says, is a virtual showing considered a legal showing? Meaning that the buyer can't cancel due to not seeing the property in person.
A virtual showing is definitely considered a legal showing. Virtual showings have been going on for years for various reasons. If buyers in a different country or whatever, it's nothing new. They're just much more popular right now, obviously. In terms of a buyer canceling, obviously there are reasons the buyer could cancel. It could be, at least in Illinois, they can cancel for any reason or no reason up to a certain date. But canceling just because it was a virtual tour, unless you have an addendum that specifically provides that. No, they cannot.
That's a good question, and so I would just support that if that is going to be the case, one, we need to let agents know that a virtual showing does constitute as a legal valid showing, and it does not give the buyer right to cancel because they didn't physically view the property, unless on the buyer side they create language that states that it's contingent upon them physically viewing the property. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Great. I don't have any other questions that are coming in now, but would love to have your perspective, Katie. And again, thanks so much for being with us today. This is incredibly helpful. What do you recommend we as agents, brokerages do more than anything else right now, and any insight, suggestions that you have for us going forward?
Sure. So more than anything, I think it's incredibly important to just communicate with your clients. I think it's a very scary time for them as well as it is for agents and everyone involved. And of course we want to always put the health and safety of our clients and our agents and our members first and foremost. In terms of getting deals done, my first advice is to make sure you're complying with applicable law. Obviously, in Arizona, you can still conduct business, but try to balance that with ensuring everyone's health and safety. And then I guess, my final point is anything that you can think of that would create liability, reach out to either your state general counsel or to us and see if we have any insight. We're happy to help. We know that these are very uncertain, confusing, and scary times. And we want to help. So if there are any unknowns, we're here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Lisa actually had a great question. We just had an issue where a buyer tried to cancel the contract because, in quotes, their financial advisor recommended they didn't buy during the COVID-19 event. However, the new AZ COVID-19 addendum states this is not a reason, and now it looks like this is going to mediation and arbitration. Katie, are you seeing a lot of cancellations due to COVID-19?
I have not seen a lot of cancellations due to COVID-19, obviously postponements, things like that. I've seen properties taken off the market, but as for properties under contract, so long as recording offices are open, title companies are open, we're typically not seeing a lot of canceled contracts. I'm happy to reach out, like I said earlier, on a couple of other things to other states and see if this is an issue, but it's not something that we've heard up the chain of command to NAR on a national level. But that's very interesting.
And to the first one, I'm curious, if a financial advisor recommends the buyer not buy right now, is that a material reason for the buyer to give the buyer an out to cancel the contract?
I mean, it would depend on the language of the contract, but a financial advisor's opinion is not, obviously, a reason. But of course, if the buyer can't secure financing for a reason like along those lines, they may have other termination rights where this could apply. So I would definitely look at that contract, have your legal counsel look at that contract and see, if they do have a termination right that is actually valid.
Okay. Great. Okay. Anybody else that have any other? Okay. And Lisa, I think we'd all agree, oh, heck no, in our opinion, that does not give a recommendation, an opinion from a financial advisor does not give a material reason to cancel the contract. So yes. Okay. Well, was there anything else that, that you'd like to add, Katie, or any other questions from our participants that we want to make sure we include? Please get them in now.
I do have a question myself.
Go ahead. All right.
I was wondering, Katie, is this information okay to share with our members?
Of course. Yes, please.
And along with the presentation that you included as well, correct?
Yes.
Perfect.
And otherwise, I will, like I said, look into addenda to listing agreements like we talked about. I'll also see if any other states are seeing an increase in canceled contracts, and I'll get back to you. And then if you guys think of any other questions or issues that you want NAR to address, always feel free to contact me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you, Lisa, for coordinating and getting this together. We've really enjoyed it. It's been very insightful and gives us more in our toolbox to move forward and get through this. So again, thank you so much for your time.
Of course, thank you for
cooperation and all the work that you're doing for us.
Thank you for having me. Stay safe and healthy, everyone.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.